Thank you very much, Serena, and thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone joining. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Basil Daher, and I'm the Assistant Director for Sustainable Development at the Texas A&M Energy Institute. And I'm excited to share with you today a lot of the work we've been doing for the past decade plus on water, energy, food nexus related research. Advancing that research on the decision support tools and analytics side, but also on the community engagement and governance applications of taking a systems approach to water, energy, and food system transformation. So in my presentation today, I'll start by highlighting some of the global risks that face us today. I'll zoom into some of the interconnected resource challenges, focusing on water, energy, and food challenges. I'll illustrate the role of analytics and decision support tools through a couple of case studies, one from Qatar and another from Lebanon. After that, I'll highlight and introduce a 7-question guideline to guide whoever is interested in developing their own water, energy, food nexus assessment, which again is a guideline that we've been using in classes and for developing new case studies over the past years. I'll then highlight the role of community engagement and governance through a couple of case studies also from Texas and Jordan, and we'll wrap up with a few emerging applications that are benefiting from this systems nexus approach, including a few examples of disaster risk reduction, human and planetary health, and migration. So I'll start with a few of the trends and the risks that face us today. One of the major trends we see is global population growth, where we have recently just crossed the 8 billion mark of population growth globally, and with that comes greater demand for different products, for different resources across different regions of the world. And that comes hand in hand with economic growth that is also happening, especially in many of the highly populated, highly population-dense countries and regions across the world, which also is resulting in shifts in consumption patterns, dietary patterns, which tend to be more meat-based, for example, when we're talking about dietary patterns, as well as more consumptive patterns in general, which is also creating more pressures and more demands on our resource systems. Another trend we're seeing is the rising global temperatures, where over the past 30, 40 years, we can see in this map by NOAA, looking at the change in temperature over that period of time, how most of the world has been seeing a rise in temperatures, change in temperatures, which also has implications on rainfall patterns, impacts on agricultural activity, on crop yields, among others. Another trend we're seeing is urbanization. Sometime around 2007, more people in the world started living in cities compared to rural areas, and that trend continues to grow, where more and more people are living in cities, where we see the global population in rural areas plateau and stabilize around 3.5 billion, and also that has implications on different supply chains, on different pressures on our infrastructure in cities, as well as pressures on resource systems that are localized within those city landscapes. To give a few examples of these urbanization trends that we're seeing, these are maps of city of Las Vegas, for example, where we can see the transformation of a desert environment into a city that's been growing over time and highly relying on groundwater in the region, again putting pressures on these local ecosystems and resource systems. Another example which we will be exploring in more depth later is the city of San Antonio, where we can see also the growing city and a lot of the agricultural activity around the city, which is also transforming the footprint and landscape with the impacts it has on the local ecosystems within those environments. Another trend we're seeing is shift in land use, where also for this is an example from Paraguay, for example, and we can see a lot of the land being transformed into agricultural activity, which also has an impact on, depending on the agricultural activity or agricultural practices and the crops being produced and the fertilizer application, the water use has an impact on water quality, on soil health, on environmental, on ecosystems within those regions, as well as transforming deserts into agricultural landscapes where with this example from Saudi Arabia, where we can see those pivot irrigation systems primarily relying on fossil water that's thousands of years old to grow food. One of the underlying conditions that also we see cited in many of the literature that focuses on food security, that focuses on economic development is poverty, and we can see in this map here the share of population living in extreme poverty and the concentration of that specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, and which has a direct implication on people's access to resources and to goals like food security, like energy security, like water security. And last but not least, trends in conflicts and refugee populations, where as a result of conflicts, which is also one of the key cited root causes for hunger, for example, we see people moving as a result of that from one place to the other, where we can see in the literature a lot of studies showing how water insecurity could be a contributing factor to making people move from one place to the other, but then also thinking in the context of conflicts, how these sudden shocks and conflicts result in quick people's movement from one country to the other, and the implication that has on host countries and the resource systems within those host countries. And according to the latest World Migration Report, we see that in 2020 there were 281 million international migrants for different reasons, for better economic opportunities, for jobs, etc. But also there are 117 million people who are living in displacement globally as a result of different conflicts and wars that have been happening in the past couple of years. And we can see in the image on the right here the flows of people, a lot of which happen within the same region, but a lot of them also happen across different regions, which again brings an idea to the complexity of these challenges and the international as well as the local nature of these challenges, and really highlighting the fact that no one discipline and no one country is able to address all of this complexity on their own, and really highlights and emphasizes the importance of international collaboration on addressing these challenges as we look at better understanding them and addressing them as we move forward. Now, after highlighting these trends and risks, I'd like to also illustrate how interconnected those risks are. And I'd like to use the Global Risks Landscape Report, which is an annual publication by the World Economic Forum, to illustrate that in a brief example. We can see here the impact likelihood map that's been developed as part of this report that is a result of a survey that's sent to more than 1,000 academics, business executives, NGOs, government officials, international organizations, asking them specific question of what risks do you expect us to face globally in the next year? So this was a survey that was shared in 2019, asking them about the possible risks they see in coming in 2020. And we can see, first of all, the first reflection is the wide range of these risks, from economic to environmental to geopolitical, technological, social, societal risks. But why I chose this year in particular, we all know what happened in 2020, and what started with an infectious disease and a public health risk ended up contributing to different risks and shocks that we saw across different systems. We saw food supply chain disruptions. We saw energy price shocks. We saw financial failures, growth in unemployment, financial crises during that year. So really, this is an illustration of how highly interconnected those risks and challenges that we face today are. And the third reflection that I'd like you to take from this graph here is where infectious diseases lie on that graph. So while experts have indicated that this would be a high impact risk, you can see that it ranked relatively lower on the likelihood scale of this graph here, which also highlights how hard it is often to predict such risks and such shocks. Which really, again, with these complex interconnected challenges that are often hard to predict, it can't be emphasized enough how important it is for us to understand how interconnected those systems are, and to take a systems approach in addressing those challenges that we face today, and challenges that will often require a rapid response, the way we needed to respond to COVID, and the high level of cooperation that required from private sector, public sector, civil society cooperation. So I would argue that in order for us to improve our resilience, future resilience moving forward, we need to invest in two key types of infrastructure. And those infrastructure are not necessarily physical brick and mortar infrastructure, but we need to better invest in environments that would allow us to innovate at the interface of different disciplines. No one discipline, no one research expertise will be able to address all of this complexity that we see here. So we need those enabling environments that will allow us to innovate and develop new innovative research at the interface of these disciplines. And the second is an environment that allows us to investing in environments that would allow us to innovate in ways we cooperate across different sectors and with different types of actors. So zooming in from that global risks landscape to focusing more on water, energy, and food challenges that lie ahead. By 2050, we are expected to need 55% more water, 50 to 60% more food, and 80% more energy. And that's under, again, pressures of global growing population, climate change, urbanization, shifts in land use that we just saw earlier. And while these are grand challenges that are important for us to address, that's not the whole picture. These grand challenges are very much interconnected. 70% of our fresh water is used by the agricultural sector. 15% of our global freshwater withdrawal goes for energy production, and 30% of our world energy is consumed by the food sector, from farm to market, thinking across the whole food value chain. And that's at a time where more than 2.2 billion still lack access to safe drinking water, more than 700 million people still suffer from chronic hunger, and more than 740 million still lack access to electricity. Now, not all of these challenges will be faced similarly across different regions of the world. Different regions will have different access to resources, different access to technologies, different access to adaptive capacities, different governance structures and cooperation mechanisms that would allow us to better maybe anticipate some of these challenges and better respond to them. But these are global challenges that will take different shapes and levels of urgency across different hotspots globally. And understanding how interconnected those challenges as we try to address any of them is going to be very important. So many of us here in the room might be specifically interested in addressing food security related challenges, or improving water access, or improving energy access, or improving economic development. But really at the core of addressing these challenges needs to be an understanding of how all of these challenges are interconnected, and how in relation to that, opportunities for addressing these challenges are also interconnected. And I'd like you to also reflect on how these resource systems are we're not only talking about biophysical resources here, but really need to think about the stakeholders and players that are playing a role in governing those resource systems, in managing the supply chains of these resource systems, and in consuming resources and products across these value chains. So understanding the objectives and goals of each of these types of actors and stakeholders, and how they interact among each other, is also very important as we try to address these challenges. Now, the water, energy, food nexus research area has been a growing area over the past decade or so, with many groups that are working on different aspects of addressing water, energy, food security challenges, either through developing different tools, looking at different governance innovations, different technologies, different types of incentives that could allow us to better unlock the synergies across different sectors. And so this is just a quick representation of the different key groups that have been active in this area, and the different institutions. And I'm very proud to see how big of a footprint Texas A&M has had in the past 10 years in contributing to this line of research, as we see on the network map on the right. Now, as we address these challenges, I'd like to share with you the outcome of a policy brief that was published, which was an outcome of a regional dialogue we did a couple of years ago, which was in collaboration with EME and UNESCO in Beirut, which brought together stakeholders, government representatives from across different countries in the region to try to think of how could we build resilience in fragile environments through a water, energy, food nexus approach. And these are 7 strategic action areas that emerged, and which I'll be touching on in different ways through the different case studies I'll be sharing. So it's important that we, as we understand the interconnections between those resource challenges, that we quantify those interconnections, develop the right tools and analytics to better monitor these trends, better evaluate different pathways moving forward to guide evidence-based decision making. It's important that we also ensure that we have policy coherence across the strategies and plans that are developed by the different sectors, different ministries in a country. It's important that we invest in enabling environments that allow for science policy dialogue, again, to make sure that science that's being developed is guiding evidence-based decision-making, ensuring that we have stakeholder engagement and outreach, engaging local communities and understanding local contexts, and possible interventions at local scales and at different scales based on that local context, and while ensuring that we are including stakeholder preferences and goals in the process. I can't emphasize enough the importance of capacity building as well across the board in terms of building next generation leadership and systems thinking, and as well as ensuring that those who are making the decisions also have that system level understanding of how these resource challenges are interconnected. And also, last but not least, looking at the innovation side, scaling up successful innovations, and ensuring that we have the financial and investment tools and mechanisms to allow for that scale up to happen. So this is just to help paint the complexity of addressing a water, energy, food nexus hotspot. And in my presentation today, I'll maybe focus a bit on 1, 2, and 4. So the data, the governance, and the stakeholder engagement and outreach parts of this puzzle. So over the past, going back to the tools, over the past decade or so, we've seen a growth in different methods, different tools that looked at quantifying interconnections between water, energy, and food resource challenges, and develop different ways to evaluate different pathways forward. Different methods included simulation modeling, scenario analysis tools, life cycle assessments, input-output analysis, among others. And today, I'd like to share with you some of the work we've been doing at Texas A&M with developing a water, energy, food nexus tool that's a scenario analysis tool that allows us to evaluate alternative interventions, policies, technologies, social behavioral shifts, and allows us to quantify the impact of those interventions on different sustainability metrics. And this is the examples you see here on the slide are only examples of different metrics we use for doing such assessments, which are very much connected and need to be co-created with stakeholders as part of the case study that we're developing. So in these examples here, you see we're looking at water requirements, energy requirements, financial cost, investment cost, carbon footprint, land requirement associated with a scenario. But again, we could be looking at impact on job opportunities, for example, or impact on gender inclusion in some of these metrics. Again, it depends on the hotspot we're addressing, and what metrics are useful for stakeholders and that stakeholders value in order to guide their better decision making. So with the tool here, we're not trying to make a decision on behalf of the decision maker, but we're trying to provide the objective analytics based on metrics they are interested in to guide that trade-off dialogue that needs to happen between these sectors. So there will be scenarios where there will be winners and losers in some scenarios, or some trade-offs that we need to understand. So what we try to do with the developed analytics is highlight what these trade-offs are, and so that it could guide that dialogue between stakeholders. For the past years, we've been working on many case studies globally, and today, as I mentioned earlier, I'd like to highlight a couple. One, which is one of the earlier studies we did, in fact, the first study we did, which was in Qatar, and the other from Lebanon. And in the Qatar case study, so for those of you who might not be familiar with Qatar, Qatar ranks third in natural gas reserves, and so high in natural gas and oil reserves, as a very arid climate country where 99% of its water comes from desalination. So we're talking about a country with virtually little to no groundwater or surface water, where 99% of that water comes from desalination. Agriculture is limited by low water quantity and quality, with low crop yields. And what really motivated this case study, and this is, again, one of the earlier studies that we did more than 10 years ago, and that was motivated by how much Qatar relied on food imports, where 90%, more than 90% of the food that was consumed in the country was imported. And from the country's perspective, that represented a vulnerability to global markets. So a lot of the countries you might be importing from might be vulnerable to different climate-related factors or conflict-related factors that might end up affecting the food you have available in your market. So at the time, and as part of the Qatar National Vision 2030, the Qatar National Food Security Program was looking at different scenarios and different ways to address that challenge. And one of the things we did at the time was, and while one of the key questions that was being asked was, how much would it cost us to produce everything locally? So that was one of the questions being asked early on in the process. And what we started looking at is, what would such a decision mean? What implications could this have? So we started identifying and quantifying the linkages between such a decision that could be made by producing more of the food that Qatar consumes locally, on water, on energy, looking at different agricultural practices that are energy demanding. So thinking of tillage, harvesting, fertilizer production, transport, also looking at different crops and their water requirements and where we would get that water from. So looking at the different water portfolios that are available to us for agricultural production, looking at different agriculture technologies and practices. So looking at open versus protected agriculture and the respective different water and energy footprint that is associated with that, as well as different energy portfolios and the carbon footprint associated with those choices. So our second step was to translate that into a tool that allows users to develop different scenarios of food self-sufficiencies. So given a food portfolio that we have, we can decide how much of that food portfolio do we want to produce domestically. What water sources do I want to use? What energy sources do I want to use? And for that part that I'm not producing locally, where do I want to import the rest of my food from? Which countries and in what amounts? And with that is associated transportation method. So whether it's going to be by land, air, or sea. And what the tool calculates for us and quantifies for us is the water requirement, energy requirement, carbon emissions, land requirement, financial requirement associated with each of these scenarios, to which we incorporate weights for each of these outputs that reflect policy preferences that could be adjusted based on different priorities over time, which would help us result in a sustainability index that could help us evaluate the sustainability of different scenarios being considered based on how sustainability is defined by the stakeholders and by the different decision makers involved. So to illustrate that very quickly, one of the scenarios that was shared with the Qatar National Food Security Program at the time was based on the 2010 base case scenario. You can see the 8 food products on the bottom of the screen here. So we took those where they had a combined self-sufficiency of 15%. So again, pretty low self-sufficiency. Tomatoes and cucumbers were partially grown under protected agriculture. Groundwater was the main source of water for agriculture. Natural gas was the main source of energy, and imports came from 15 different countries. So we quantified the impact of that base case scenario for 2010, and to make more sense of the question that was being asked at the time and the implications of that question, we checked and asked, what if we produced 10 percentage points more of self-sufficiency for these food products, for these 8 food products? What would that mean to us? And we saw that based on our evaluation, we needed 82% more water, 153% more land, 82% more energy, etc. So that really illustrated, first of all, how a decision for increasing or having a change in strategy for agricultural production, similar to this in this case, where we're looking at vastly expanding local agricultural production, is not only a decision that could be made by an agricultural stakeholder or decision maker, but really needs to be an effort and a strategy that is coordinated across different sectors. So, for example, when we're talking about, since most of the water in Qatar comes from desalination, when we will need 82% more water, the question we need to ask is, do we have that desalination capacity, first of all? Or will we need to invest in new desalination plants to meet that additional demand? Desalination is energy intensive. Where will that energy come from? Are we interested or willing to subsidize more agricultural production using desalinated water that is energy intensive while looking at this from a strategic food security perspective, that justifies that cost or not? I mean, these are questions that this started, and looking at the land footprint also. Do we want to look at different technologies that do not require as much land or as much soil? And then also, what are the implications of that? How much energy would that need, and what cost of production would be required? And in turn, also, how much are we able to subsidize the production of that food in order for it to be competitive with other foods that we're importing? So we can see some of these questions and the trade-offs that fall at the intersection of wanting to produce more locally for more food security, for more national security, but also how that comes at a cost that needs to be addressed, needs to be quantified, needs to be evaluated across different sectors. So one thing we saw with sharing this assessment at the time was, and which started to make more sense, is a shift of narrative from full self-sufficiency to what are these trade-offs that we need to better understand and evaluate, and how could we develop a more robust trade strategy that puts less pressure on local food production and local resources, but also identifies countries of low risk to import from, and how we can diversify our sources of import. And as I mentioned, higher security comes at a high water, energy, land, and financial cost, which needs to be evaluated and understood. Now, so this is on the Qatar case study. I'd like to also illustrate the kind of a similar but more recent study we did in Lebanon, which was a collaboration with FAO, the American University of Beirut, and Texas A&M Energy Institute, where nutrition, we were asking a similar kind of question. Now Lebanon, for context also, is not as arid, is not as water stressed, and the question there was more about nutrition, really, looking at how evaluating the current food basket that we produce and looking at different scenarios we could look at to improve the nutrition value of locally produced food basket. So and doing that using a water energy food nexus approach. So as part of that project, so the key question that we asked that you see in the publication here is, can Lebanon produce its own Mediterranean food basket? And as part of that, we identified and quantified the critical interconnections between water, energy, and food systems, developed a framework that allowed us to evaluate different scenarios, which I'll share a couple of with you in a second. And last but not least, we ensured that we involved farmers in the process, and we evaluated their preferences of different activities they are willing to adopt on their farms. So this schematic gives you a quick snapshot of this framework and tool that was developed. So similar to the Qatar case study, you see the choices of different food products. So identifying your food portfolio, water sources, energy sources. Now, what's unique about this case study was that as we were developing this study, there was a financial crisis happening in Lebanon at the time, and which had a reflection on the currency conversion rate. The Lebanese pound to the dollar was fluctuating by the day, which has implications on the imports of different, the cost of importing different food crops, and how that compared to local production. The scenario outputs in this case were looking at the water requirement, land requirement, energy requirement, cost, emissions, reliance. So how much are we relying on the global market for securing a food product, and the nutritional impact of that scenario. And similar to what I presented earlier, we were interested in looking at the trade-offs between different scenarios, and for that to guide a multi-stakeholder dialogue around the trade-offs. So to give you a couple of quick examples, just to illustrate what has been done in this case, several of the highly nutritious, less resource intensive, mainly less water intensive crops, which were mainly beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas, were currently produced at a very low self-sufficiency. So less than between 10 and 20% was produced of these specific products. And so we started with a nutrition-centric scenario, saying, what if we produce 100% of these highly nutritious, less resource intensive beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas, where we keep our percentages of where we're getting our water from the same. So 20% coming from groundwater, 20% coming from surface water, 100% of the energy for water for pumping primarily comes from diesel. And then energy for food, for the different practices on the farms are also coming from diesel and gasoline under the current conversion rate in 2017. And we can see for increasing that self-sufficiency, we needed around 12% more water, more energy, 16% more land. There was a reduction in cost, which was a positive thing. So local production was cheaper than buying those products or importing those products. There was an increase in emissions because we're producing more locally. So it's within our boundary of assessment, which is at the country level. There was an increase in the nutritional value of the basket because we're producing more of these highly nutritious, high protein crops, and less reliance, obviously, because we're producing those locally and reducing our reliance on imports. So again, this shows us what should we be expecting, what are the trade-offs we should be expecting when we consider such a decision. Another scenario we looked at, which looked at in addition to increasing the self-sufficiency of beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas to 100%, there were several fruits and vegetables that were currently being produced at at a percentage that is higher than the full self-sufficiency and currently being exported. So we thought, what if we produced less of these? So we produced only to meet our local demand without exporting, and in turn produced more of our lentils, peas, beans, and chickpeas. And we can see under that scenario that we needed less water overall, but less energy. We still needed more land because of the low yield of beans, chickpeas, and lentils. Um, Sorry about that. And um, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I was interrupted. But so again, this was illustrated some of these key trade-offs between those decisions. So to reflect on some of the um, results, also I'd like to share with you the results of the survey we conducted with more than 200 farmers in the Bekaa Valley, asking them to rank the decisions they are most likely to do on their farms or accept to do on their farms. We presented them with the use of alternative energy sources, growing different crops on their farms, and use of alternative irrigation sources. So looking at treated water or treated wastewater for irrigation. And this was the rank that farmers indicated. So they were most likely to adopt alternative energy sources on their farms with the goal of improving profit. So the criteria you see on the bottom are kind of the motivating factors for them to pick that alternative or adopt that practice on their farms. So it's no surprise that number one is improving profit. But again, you see different criteria, including saving water, reducing emissions, saving land, etc. But this ranking is important for us also to reflect on the possibility of the implementability of these different interventions that we might be considering as we consider growing different crops or looking at alternative energy sources or alternative irrigation methods. So in terms of the project outcomes and policy implications, investing locally in locally producing Lebanon's needs for beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas, as you saw, results in cost savings, increased nutritional value, and reduced reliance on foreign markets, but comes at an additional water, energy, land, and carbon footprints that need to be accounted for. And given the uncertainty of future currently conversion rates in Lebanon, it becomes more critical to identify a strategic food basket that could be produced locally to reduce that reliance on foreign markets. So as we reflect on some of the key messages and way forward based on some of these scenarios. And again, I selected a couple of representative scenarios, but there's several others that were explored as part of the paper, and I invite you to check that out if you're also interested. So one is to reallocate. So there are three um, types of interventions, so to speak, or areas of potential for exploring beyond zero-sum game solutions that first look at reallocation of resources within the existing resource pie, so to speak. So by strategically reallocating resources from producing crops that exceed full self-sufficiency to less resource-intensive and nutrition-rich crops with lower self-sufficiencies, we can have lower reliance on foreign markets while having water, energy, cost, emission savings. The trade-offs that exist between allocating resources to produce more food for domestic production versus export exist. And again, given the uncertainty of future currency conversion rates, it becomes very critical that we identify a strategic food basket that could be produced locally to reduce reliance on foreign markets. The second is expanding on the existing potential of resources that could be done by improving efficiencies and management practices in current operations on one hand, and exploring synergies across sectors and another. So we can think of ways we can improve yield and productivity of highly nutritious crops with low irrigation requirements by looking at better variety, better cropping patterns, different technologies. Also, we can look at intercropping that could be used to minimize land use or restoration of marginal degraded land that are currently not being used for agricultural production. In addition to improving irrigation efficiencies and investing in renewable energies on farms to explore potential also of treated water for agriculture, and all to improve the competitiveness of local production compared to import. And last is the importance of creating an enabling environment that is critical to develop the necessary incentives for farmers to grow new crops, to switch to alternative energy sources, to switch to alternative water sources, and invest in more efficient technologies, water energy efficient technologies, while accounting for their preferences, as we saw in the process earlier. Going back to the message that I shared earlier, that we are not only talking about biophysical resource systems here. Another study that we did that focused also on Lebanon, did a systematic review of the literature, actually, looking at the key challenges that are facing Lebanon in terms of water, energy, and food security. And as we started looking at the interconnections between those challenges, and this is really a demonstration of how this systems approach could really help us understand some of the root causes of the challenges being faced. We were able, through that systematic review that focused on water, energy, and food challenges, to identify different underlying political and economic conditions, including confessional political system in Lebanon, corruption and mismanagement, political and financial reliance on external actors, which are more longer-term underlying conditions, but also the impact of shocks and triggering events like the refugee crisis, like the financial crisis, like the COVID pandemic, the port explosion, as well as different regional geopolitical tensions, which have impacts on resource shortages, on financial crises, on supply chain disruptions, social unrest, immigration, brain drain, and health implications, all of which, again, were documented in the literature that was reviewed. So as after illustrating a couple of examples of using these tools, and here I'd like to reflect on maybe one of the ways we were initially approaching this, as we started with the development of the tool and customizing it for different case studies. And our initial thinking was that with the Qatar tool that was developed, that we will continue adding layers to that tool to help address different questions. And we soon realized that after starting working on the second case study and the third case study and the different context, how much context matters and how much stakeholders and the questions they are asking matters, how much scale matters, how much the assessment criteria we are using to evaluate different scenarios will change from one case study to another to reflect those stakeholder priorities. So as a result, we developed this 7-question guideline for supporting whoever, any researchers who are interested in developing new studies, new assessments for different water, energy, food nexus hotspots, which starts by and these are not necessarily chronological. It's a messy process, and there's a lot of feedback between those steps, where we start by identifying the critical question that we're trying to ask. At what scale are we asking that question? Do we want do an assessment at a farm level, at a regional level, at a country level, at a global level. What is our system definition? As you saw, different maps of all of these interconnected systems. But as we address that critical question, what will be part of the boundaries of our assessment versus others that we recognize are interconnected to our systems, but are not as critical to answer that question, which is a very important step. Who are our stakeholders? And again, revisiting, is that the right question that they are asking and interested in? And what assessment are they interested in? What metrics are they interested in to evaluate different scenarios? Do we have all of that data? Or is that data not available? Do we need to look at proxy data for some of the data that we're looking at? For example, in some of the data that we used for the Qatar case study, data was not available in Qatar, so we ended up using similar data, especially related to some of the kind of the ecological type data from Saudi Arabia, which was it's a neighboring country with a similar climatic conditions and the similar ecosystem. So it made sense to make some assumptions there to address some of the data gaps. And last but not least, how do we want to communicate the results with stakeholders? There's a lot of complexity, as you saw, that's involved in the background, in identifying those interconnections and collecting the data and developing the scenarios. But then what is that one pager that needs to go to a decision maker to communicate that those trade-offs effectively in order to guide better evidence-based decision making? And we have like a 7-question process with details on how to address that is outlined in our publication on modeling the water energy food nexus as a 7-question guideline, which I'd be happy to share with you following this webinar and make that resource available to you to guide the development of future case studies that you might be interested in. In the remaining time, and I'd like to, I'll try to keep this quick and short. I'd like to focus more on the community engagement and the governance aspects. And I'll start by highlighting a case study we've been working on for the past several years in Texas, specifically in the region of where San Antonio, one of the rapidly growing cities in Texas and in the US lies, which has a neighboring Eagle Ford Shale, which is one of the shale areas where a lot of energy development happens, a lot of hydraulic fracturing happens, which is a water-intensive natural gas producing process, as well as a lot of agricultural activity that's surrounding the city. And so to give you a sense of that of those sectors and the growth of those sectors, all of the dots you see on the map here are water wells. The blue dots are water wells for municipal use. The green dots are water wells for irrigation, and the red dots are water wells for energy production. And all of these sectors are projected to grow. We're expecting the city to continue growing. We're expecting the agricultural sector to continue growing, and we're expecting the energy sector to continue growing. So you can clearly and quickly see how the growth of these sectors across this area could become in competition with one another. And what motivated our study at the time was to ask a specific question: are these sectors and stakeholders across these sectors talking to each other? Are they communicating with each other? Are they coordinating with each other? So we sent a survey which was completed by more than 100 water public officials in San Antonio, asking them that specific question. What is the frequency of your communication with all of we presented a long list of different water, energy, food, and cross-cutting stakeholders and players in the region. And with cross-cutting, we're talking about players like the mayor's office, for example, which have more of a cross-cutting mandate. And 90% of the responses we received showed zero communication with all of the presented stakeholders and actors across sectors in the region. Out of the 10% of communication, so the social network map you see here represents 10% of the possible broader social network. You can see that a lot of that communication is happening between water and all other water sector officials, and much less with water and energy. And as we look at, so this is at any level of communication, any frequency of communication over the last year. As we look at more frequent levels of communication, we look at weekly, for example, communication, we can see that most of the network drops, and a lot of the remaining links are predominantly water public officials to other water public officials in the region. So we asked the question why. In one of the stakeholder engagement workshops, we presented that map that I shared with you earlier on the potential growing competition between the sectors and based on the different water wells data, and the social network map, which showed little communication happening between the sectors. And some of the reasons and barriers that were communicated to us was institutional mandates, lack of coordination mechanisms. So one of the key remarks actually that were made at that workshop was that this is a great presentation. We now know better, but we will go back to our offices and we can't do much about it. It's not part of our job. It's not part of the mandate of our organization. So unless there is an intentional mechanism that allows for this kind of coordination to happen and that revisits the mandates of our institutions, these integrative planning activities are not going to happen on their own. So that was really highlighting one of the key barriers that exists today. And with that comes hand in hand the financial barrier also. Who will pay for these kind of integrative planning activities? Who will pay for that time and effort that's involved in that increased communication? Other barriers included also the uniformity of language. So we have different sectors speaking different languages, using different syntax, abbreviations, etc., which makes it harder to do this kind of coordination unless there's again an intention to do that. Another is differences in planning horizons. You see the water sector, for example, developing a 5-year water plan where we look at more of a 2050 decarbonization goal for the energy sector, which also creates some ideological differences. And last but not least, also lack of common goals and collaborative projects where we have more of the silo mentality across the sectors rather than looking at what are some of the collective goals that we can work towards. And this is where I'd like to highlight the UN Sustainable Development goals and how these goals are also, we need to work toward them while understanding how interconnected they are with one another. And also in the context of this presentation, highlighting how we do have goals that directly touch on water, energy, and food security related challenges, but also ensuring that we are not advancing one goal at the expense of others. And kind of a follow-up project and conversation with the San Antonio community has been to develop a localized sustainability dashboard at the city level and asking community residents across different sectors, what does sustainability mean to you? What does no hunger mean to you? What does good education mean to you? What does gender equity mean to you? What does good energy access mean to you? And what are the metrics you want to use that you think are appropriate and relevant for the city of San Antonio? So we could have that platform with the goal of having that platform available to the city to guide better evidence-based decision making and planning to guide future programming for the city. So we've been meeting with community members over the past couple of years, really looking at different sets of goals, refining those, and ensuring that that dashboard is developed in a way that is useful for the community, because again, this is not a research project that is meant to have only a publication as an outcome, but meant for the city to use this as a resource to guide future planning. So we've been engaging again with the community around those, and ensuring that we report back every time we meet with the community on the outcomes of these discussions. Serena, I see that am I going over time, or do I have 5 more minutes?
5 more minutes is fine, and then
Okay.
we will have to conclude. Yeah.
Okay. One last case study I'd like to quickly go over is or an example of progress toward developing a water energy food nexus governance structure that I'd like to share with you, since it's an ongoing development. I won't go into too many details. I'll try to finish quickly here, but I'd like you to be aware of this uh, of that part of the economic development plan in Jordan, and given the scarcity of water, energy, and food availability in the country, has recognized the importance of establishing a Nexus Council as part of the economic development, economic modernization vision. And we've been working on a project that's been supported by GIZ with partners from Jordan and other institutions, including Texas A&M as well, to meet with local partners, with stakeholders, identify some of the key cross-sectoral challenges that are facing the country, including which highlighted some of the key gaps, including different strategic interests across sectors, lack of common long-term vision, lack of proper coordination, which again echo what we just heard from San Antonio. So what the barriers we heard in the San Antonio case study are not unique to San Antonio, but are in fact really universal challenges that we see once and again across different sectors. And what I'd like to share with you is a water energy food nexus governance framework that we've worked with local stakeholders to develop, which was approved by the Prime Minister's office last year, that will develop a water, energy, food, environment steering committee at the Secretary General's level of the different ministries. This WEFI, so with the environment Nexus framework, is coordinated by the Ministry of Planning, which again, we have a steering committee of director generals, secretary generals, who will be managing the steering committee, to which we have a technical coordination committee representing different directors and subject matter experts, who's supported also by intersectoral working groups who could be working on different types of projects, ultimately reporting back to the Prime Minister's office to guide future planning across the different sectors, and that is supported by science and academic institutions, as well as different international development partners. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. Several gaps and challenges remain in terms of developing the appropriate tools, ensuring that we have the right capacity for operationalizing that governance framework, as well as ensuring that we have the right mechanisms for data exchange and gathering across sectors. I'll maybe jump to my conclusion slide here, and would be happy to make the slides available to you, just so that we keep some time for Q&A. The last message I'd like to leave you with is really the complexity of these interconnected challenges that no one discipline and no one sector will be able to address independently. So at the core of this, I'll reiterate what I started with is the importance of investing in 3 enabling environments: one that enables the development of interdisciplinary research that builds on the expertise of different research disciplines in order to develop unique, innovative solutions at the interface of these disciplines. We need to invest in enabling environments that ensure that we better cooperate across different sectors, and ensure that we're doing that hand in hand also. So not having research and stakeholders independent, but really co-creating, co-framing those research questions, and having stakeholders, partners of the whole research process. So adopting a systems approach to guide water, energy, food systems transformation cannot be overstated, given the interdependency that we saw and the complexity that we saw throughout this presentation. There's a major role for tools and analytics and the role that they can play in guiding evidence-based decision-making to guide more sustainable, equitable strategies across sectors. In terms of the tools, there's no one-size-fits-all tool. There are different tools that are required for different contexts to answer different questions at different scales, different data resolutions, and to address the questions of different stakeholders. So while we do require this type of systems, holistic assessments, these assessments need to be localized and grounded in the local context. And we do that through ensuring that we're engaging local communities as part of this process. And my last message is perhaps one of the, I think that the most important also is ensuring that we are building capacity of the new generation of leaders and systems thinkers who are able to understand all of this complexity and value the importance of collaborating across sectors and across research disciplines. I'll stop here. I hope this was not too long and that I kept you interested and engaged throughout the presentation, but I'm happy to take questions, have a discussion around what has been presented, and I invite you to connect and to continue the conversation beyond this session as well.
Thank you, Basil. That was really fascinating, all those case studies, and also unraveling those resources and the complexity of all of this. I'll start with some questions from and the questions and answers. I have some other questions also to you. So the first question was about why land was not considered in the Nexus, although it was seen to be a major role. So I think this was about the Qatar study.
Land was indeed one of the metrics that were used to evaluate the impacts of different scenarios. As we looked at different scenarios of local food production, what we were quantifying was land footprint, energy footprint, water footprint, carbon emissions, cost. So land was indeed one of the factors that are being considered. And maybe to take that question at a higher level, maybe, and philosophically say, why wasn't it water, energy, land, food nexus, or if that's what you were referring to also. That was actually a question that we spent a lot of time on at the beginning, and trying to think of what should be included. And in fact, all of these metrics that we're talking about are included, but the decisions that we're making. So what we have developed is a tool that could guide ministries that are developing strategies, policies across their respective ministries. And with that, we were looking at the decision for increasing food self-sufficiency, or looking at your energy strategy or water strategy, which certainly has implications on ecosystems, which has implications on land. But there's not a ministry for land, for example, in these countries, but rather a ministry for agriculture that is developing so as part of that, initially we were thinking we should include climate change also, and include land, and include ecosystems and others. And in fact, they are included, but included as an output of these decisions that are made by the strategies that are developed by the ministries of water, energy, and food.
Let me ask you a follow-up question, then I'm going to switch over to our director. So do you think it's also a matter of how you communicate it? So if you talk about water, energy, food, then people know more or less where you're going. But if you start adding a long list of water, energy, food, climate, land, soil, biota, then maybe it's not so. It's not one of those words that people would recognize, or was that not your consideration?
Part of it is that, for sure. And I think at the core of economic security and when we're talking about national security, I mean, these are sectors and securities that people can easily connect with. We need water, we need energy, we need food. And again, that is not to discount the importance of any of the other sectors and systems, which, based on the different case study that we're studying and based on the context, depending on how critical that specific system would be to be brought up into the discussion and into the evaluation, it would have a reflection of what is quantified and what ultimately is being measured as part of these metrics.
I see, Edel, you raised your hand. Would you like to answer a question?
No, not answering a question.
Oh, ask a question.
Can I already, or do you?
Yes, you can go.
So thank you so much, Basil, for your presentation. I have a question. I could not see the number of the slide where you had this map of the different actors, and it said 90% did not interact. So I think, and then you had you called it index. I would call it a vector, but however we call it in the end. What I thought, the complexity is really high. And then if 90% of the people don't interact, maybe the information is too complex. So I'm wondering, but then you had this photo where I thought, there are real people behind what you are doing. So this gives me hope. Can you just also share your experience? Why didn't they interact? Was the matter too complex, or was it just that they could not process the data they got? What do you perceive as the main barriers for your observations?
Thank you, Adel, for this question. And to clarify, the survey was sent to them to ask them about their frequency of communication as part of their regular operation. So it was not specific a project or data that they had to communicate between each other. So we were just curious, given the growth of these sectors and the potential growing competition between sectors, whether there is some communication and coordination happening between them. So it was a simple question of, in the past year, what was the frequency of your communication between your institution and all of these institutions? And that's where we saw that there is very little that's happening across different sectors. And again, when we investigated that further as part of our engagement with them, I would say my reflection on that was mostly the institutional mandates and lack of coordination mechanisms was one of the key factors. So while people understood the need to communicate more, to coordinate more, to do these kind of coordinated planning activities, they didn't have the right institutional mechanisms to do it. And this is where, I mean, capacity building is important, but then if you just build capacity without ensuring that you have the right institutional mandates and setup and mechanisms to allow for coordinated planning to happen, it's not just going to happen because people know better. So you need both, I think. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Then I'm going to take the next question from the questions here on the panel. So Sarosh says, thank you for your nice presentation. As we are aware of the data needs and challenges in Nexus assessment, I noticed in your Qatar case study that you used data from a neighboring country. However, the regions were similar to some extent, but how could we make this approach more standard? I would like to hear your opinion on whether developing a standard framework on a data management basis is feasible, as well as whether it would be more effective in making the Nexus assessment robust.
Thank you, Sarosh. This is a very good question. And I think our reflection on this question, this is obviously something we think a lot about as we develop these case studies, and certainly data is a challenge. And I can tell you in the case of Qatar, I had to, in some cases, digitize data for the first time. I was collecting data that was scanned and had to digitize for the first. So again, formats, even within the same ministry across different years, could change also. So even within the same country, you have sometimes a lot of challenges and considerations around data. A standardized data framework, I think our take on that has been the 7-question guideline, has been our attempt to kind of standardize the approach without being too prescriptive on the specifics that need to be collected to ensure that you keep some room for that context within different countries, which again will require asking different questions, will require assessing different outputs, and might require different kind of data at different scales. So I think I see the value in having more of a standard approach to it, but I think maybe there could be some advancements done in that direction across a certain scale. For example, like for assessments at the country level, maybe we could, after seeing many of the case studies that have been developed, extract some patterns of some of the key metrics, key indicators that are being considered, and mainstream that. And I think that would be a very interesting exercise to do.
Yeah, I can just add also from my background on working with data and with data standards that, so what struck me is on your barriers slide, I've seen this very often also mentioned as barriers to data sharing and data integration. So I think this is a very similar challenge, and also your network of people not communicating. I've seen similar networks about local authorities having to compile certain kinds of data. And now we're talking registers, we're not even talking derived data. So this is the base data. And sometimes it's the communication, it's the mandate, it's all these things. So it seems to be like a governance challenge more than anything else. And there have been approaches, there have been bottom-up approaches, there have been top-down approaches. I don't know what you think. I mean, sometimes I think it needs to come from the top with mandates, but you also need to do the capacity building bottom and then each other. I don't know what your experience is.
I think it needs to be both. I think it needs to be both. You need both. And I've seen that in the case of Jordan that I just quickly shared. So the having the establishment of a water, energy, food, environment governance framework as part of the economic vision that is endorsed at the highest political level creates some momentum and allows for these discussions to happen. But then as you have these discussions, you really need to go on the ground and ensure that the people involved, the communities involved, the ministries involved, the technical people who are working on these are part of this vision. And so I think that the top catalyzes the movement in that direction, but then the implementation and how you operationalize it need to include a lot of the bottom-up approaches.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I see you raised your hand. Have you got a new question, or do you want to comment? Can we just take the questions from the panel first?
You can take the questions on the panel first, and I can go last.
Okay, then let's have a look. So Tamur says, thank you again for your presentation. Considering the different scenarios and Nexus modeling presented, how can integrated strategies within the water energy food nexus be adapted to ensure food security in regions heavily impacted by climate change and conflicts, particularly when these crises exacerbate resource scarcity and disrupt supply chains? It seems that these parameters not clearly considered in your scenarios for making decisions. And maybe you have partially answered that about, at least about the climate change and the conflicts.
Yes. Thank you very much, Tamer. Glad to see you here. This has not necessarily been part of the Qatar case study per se, which was again one of the earlier case studies, but in the policy brief I shared on this 7 strategic areas that focus specifically on fragile and conflict affected contexts for agri-food systems. We have identified several opportunities for doing that through identifying different early warning monitoring systems with appropriate metrics that could be involved there, that could ultimately be incorporated into our scenario development. But yes, I mean, I appreciate your observation. This has not been part of the scenarios that have been developed for the Qatar case study specifically, but it's certainly something that needs to be evaluated.
And I guess will make it just even more complex. I think you showed
Yes.
a lot of complexity and just adding another parameter. Yeah. Okay, then we have an anonymous question. I'm not sure, what factors did you have to choose the interlinkage that you performed the analysis? I'm not sure I understand. Maybe that person can just expand their question.
Yeah,
And then let's take a next one from Tamura. What are the most reliable context-sensitive indicators for evaluating the efficiency and sustainability of water, energy, food nexus interventions?
What are the most reliable and context-sensitive indicators for evaluating the efficiency and sustainability of Nexus interventions? Very good question. Very good question. And I think this question requires a reflection on several case studies and looking at patterns of different indicators across case studies. I can say maybe on the context sensitive, I would say again, but a common subset of indicators that we've been looking at has been impact on water resource use, impact on reliance on global markets for food, carbon emissions, so carbon footprint, land footprint. In cases like a case study we've done in Morocco, for example, looked which looked at the phosphate production industry, looked at broader food security related impacts of fertilizer production coming from phosphate. So this is a hard question to answer. This is a hard question to answer. I see my mind going in different directions for different case studies, and yeah, I'm not sure there's an easy answer for that. That doesn't go back to the context of the case study itself.
And maybe for reliability also, one needs to look back for a time. I mean, you can't just very soon say it was reliable. Maybe it needs a longitudinal approach. Let's take, I see we're running out of time. Let's take one question from Kamal and then we'll switch to Daniel. So Kamal wanted to ask, from your presentation map, he noticed the research on the resource nexus in Bangladesh. Could you share which areas you focused on and which hold potential future research? I recently published an article on applying the resource nexus concept in the textile industry, considering water, energy, ecosystems, and agri-food. Is there an opportunity to collaborate or build a network to explore the next this approach further? Maybe a
Absolutely.
quick comment there, and
Absolutely.
then
I'll share the link to the article with you in the chat. In that article, we basically looked at the national strategies of water, energy, and food ministries in Bangladesh, and looked at them vis-a-vis their alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals for SDG 2, 6, and 7, and looked at some of the goals that each of these strategies is trying to achieve by 2030 and how that aligns with different SDG indicators. I'm sharing the DOE number, but let me see if I could share the link. But I have my contact information on the slide, and then please reach out, and I would be happy to discuss any collaboration opportunities. I don't know if the participants are seeing the comments that I'm putting, but maybe those could be shared with.
Simi, you can just put it in the questions and answers, and then then it will be there.
Okay.
Yeah, Wasim can do it for you because he can copy chat with there. Then we can just ask a last question to Daniel. Sorry, and thanks for waiting, Daniel.
Yes, thank you, Basil, very much for sharing the insights from several case studies and highlighting that there are complexities not only when we look at the ways that the different resources are interlinked, but also that the stakeholders that manage them that are typically sectoral. When we look at that, we also need to look at these interlinkages. And it was actually interesting for me to hear, as I come from integrated water resources management, that in one case you found the water community in the end to be the one that was the most active, or the one that was most constantly active. As you utilized the WEF Nexus approach, you already had one question that asked about land as a resource. Our institute in general focuses on the resource nexus. What would you say are other resources that you would feel would be important to integrate in these studies? Like, which would be maybe the one resource where you would say this is the most important one to add? Could this be biota? Could it be soil? Could it be, you mentioned fertilizers, for example, where we would need to think about maybe materials that come from mining?
Well, thank you, Daniel. Very, very interesting question. And my reflection on that is, I think at the core of what all of us are talking about, whether we consider this nexus or that nexus or include these resources or others, is the importance of taking a systems approach and realizing how interconnected those resources and those challenges are. To answer your question about an additional resource, one of the additional resources we've been looking at or considering as a resource is health. So looking broadly speaking at human health and at planetary health, but also looking at the implications of decisions we are making across water, energy, and food sectors on human health, and looking at different factors, including cardiovascular risk, for example, or on planetary health and looking at soil health and looking at the health of ecosystems, which I actually have a couple of slides for, but didn't have the time to go over. But we have an NIH-funded project that we started with last year to establish a global center for climate change and water, energy, food, health systems in Jordan, and where we're exploring a lot of these interconnections and looking at different health implications and health, broadly speaking, again, of human health and of ecosystems health, of different agricultural practices, of different water access, water quality, as well as different energy portfolios and their impact on air quality and on different health-related indicators. So I would say health, broadly speaking, could be looked at as that an additional resource that we're actively looking at.
Thank you, Basil.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you, Basil, from our side. We'll have to conclude now, for taking the time. I know you're not where you usually are. Thank you for making time in your schedule, and all the best for the rest of your day at the AGU. It's really interesting to get insight into what you have done. And from the questions, I think you could see how relevant this is to what we do here at UNU Flores. I would also like to thank our participants for taking time to listen and engaging with our speaker in this very active way. And then before we go, an invitation, our next Nexus Seminar will be on the 13th of January, same time as today. Professor Manu Ramutsendela from South Africa will talk to us about reframing sustainability through the lens of socio-ecological debt. So I'm looking forward to seeing all of you here. Thank you. Have a nice day.